The syringe went into the IV line at 11:47 p.m. No one in Trauma Bay 3 saw it happen. Not the attending, not the circulating nurse, not the two residents hovering over their clipboards pretending to look competent. 41 seconds later, the man in the bed, a decorated Navy admiral with 3 wars behind him, would begin to die in a room full of people whose entire careers were built around keeping people alive. One person saw it. A rookie ER nurse named Mara Voss standing in the corner with a bag of saline she'd been told to hang quietly and then disappear. She saw the syringe, she recognized what was in it, and for one terrible second she understood exactly what was about to happen and what it was going to cost her to stop it. Before we go any further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now because this channel is where stories like this one live. Real tension, real stakes, characters who hit the floor and still find a way to stand back up. If this is the kind of story that keeps you awake until the last second, drop a like so more people can find it. And tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I genuinely want to know how far this story travels. Now let's go back to Trauma Bay 3. The hospital was called Vantage Memorial Medical Center, and it sat on the western edge of Harlan, Colorado, in the kind of geography that made people feel both free and forgotten. Mountains to the west, nothing much to the east, and a population that cycled through boom and bust depending on which federal contracts were currently pointed at the military installation 40 miles up the road. Fort Cavell had been Harlan's economic heartbeat for 60 years. When the base did well, the town did well. When things went quiet at Cavell, you felt it in the grocery stores and the half-empty parking lots outside Vantage Memorial. It was a Tuesday in early March when the hospital received word that a patient was being rerouted to their facility. Not a car accident, not a stroke. The call came through official military channels, which meant it came with a level of bureaucratic weight that made hospital administrator Dorothy Greer stand up straighter than she had in months. The patient was a high-value individual. The transfer was time-sensitive. The usual chain of notifications had been compressed into about 40 minutes. That part wasn't explained. What got explained, tersely and clearly, was that Admiral Marcus Webb, 3 decades of naval service, currently attached to a Senate Defense Oversight Committee, had experienced a cardiac event during a transport flight and was being diverted to Vantage Memorial because Harlan's altitude profile and facilities matched the immediate care window better than Denver. It was the kind of explanation that answered the surface question while creating 6 new ones underneath it. The trauma chief, Dr. Sebastian Orr, took personal command of the situation the moment he heard the Admiral's name. Orr was known in the hospital the way certain weather systems are known. You tracked him from a distance and adjusted your plans accordingly. He was 53, had trained at Johns Hopkins, and had a habit of treating every room he walked into as a room that had been waiting for him to arrive. He was good at what he did. He was also the kind of person who confused being good at something with being impossible to question. "I want my team, and only my team in that bay," Orr said to the charge nurse before the Admiral's helicopter had even landed. "Confirm that." The charge nurse confirmed it. That should have been the end of Mara Voss's involvement in the night. She was 3 months into her ER rotation. She was 29 years old and had a nursing degree from a mid-tier state university and a work history that, on paper, looked like someone who had taken a very long detour before arriving at medicine. She didn't talk much about the years between 22 and 26. She told people she'd worked overseas, done some aid work, decided she wanted to do something with more structure. People generally nodded and moved on because Mara didn't invite follow-up questions. She was competent, quiet. She did her job without drama, which in an ER meant she was more valuable than half the people with twice her credentials. But she wasn't on Orr's list. She wasn't part of the team he'd handpicked for the Admiral's Bay. She was in the supply corridor when the helicopter came in, restocking a cart that one of the day nurses had left incomplete. She heard the rotors. She heard the controlled chaos of the landing team outside, and she went back to counting IV bags. Except there was a mix-up. There was a miscommunication between the charge nurse and the Bay assignment board, the kind of small procedural confusion that happens in every busy emergency department somewhere around the 11 o'clock hour, when everyone is tired and operating on institutional muscle memory. A medication order got routed through the wrong station. The runner who was supposed to deliver a specific saline bag to Bay 3 was pulled to a code in the pediatric annex. Someone looked at the cart in the corridor, saw Mara standing there, and told her to take it up. Bay 3. Celine drip. Hang it and note the time. She said okay. She took the bag. She walked down the hall. The bay was controlled chaos managed to look like order. 2 residents were documenting. A respiratory tech was calibrating equipment. Dr. Orr stood at the foot of the bed, issuing instructions in the quiet, precise way of someone who understood that volume was for people who weren't confident in their authority. Admiral Marcus Webb lay on the gurney with the particular stillness of a man whose body had decided to conserve everything it had left. He was 61, gray-haired, still broad across the shoulders, even diminished by whatever had happened on that plane. Mara moved to the IV pole. She began to set up the saline line. That was when she saw the secondary line. It was already threaded into the port. That wasn't unusual. The transport team would have established access in the air. What was unusual was the residue. A faint crystalline trace at the junction point. Almost nothing. The kind of thing you wouldn't see unless you were standing at exactly the right angle under exactly the right light. She noticed it the way she noticed things, which was all at once and without knowing she was doing it. Her hands stopped. She knew that residue. She had seen it twice in her life. Once in a field hospital in a country she was not permitted to name, running from a compound that had been hit with something that didn't have an official designation yet. Once on the hands of a man she had watched die in under 4 minutes, despite everything anyone around him had tried to do. The substance was not in any standard toxicology database she had ever found. She had never seen it in a hospital setting. She had never expected to. "Excuse me," she said. Orr didn't look up. "There's something in the secondary line. I need someone to check this before—" "Nurse." Orr's voice was flat and final. "You're not on this team. Hang the saline and step back." "I understand that, but there's a residue at the junction, and I think—" "Dr. Fielding." Orr addressed one of his residents without looking at Mara. "Please clarify to this nurse what her role is in this bay." The resident, a young man with the unhappy expression of someone doing exactly what they needed to do to not get into trouble, turned to Mara. "You're here to hang the saline, that's it." "The secondary line has contamination," Mara said. She wasn't raising her voice. She was just saying the words because they were true and they needed to be said. "I'm asking someone to pull it and test it before it delivers anything more into this patient." The other resident looked up now. The respiratory tech paused. For about 3 seconds, the room was very quiet. Then Orr walked to her. He didn't touch her. He stopped 2 feet away and looked at her with the specific kind of contempt reserved for people who believe they are being patient, when in fact they have long since stopped being patient. "You're a floor nurse on a rotation who was sent here to hang a bag. You don't have the training, the credentials, or the clearance to question anything about this patient's care. If you say one more word about that line, I will have you removed." Mara looked at the line. She looked at the Admiral. She looked at the trace of crystalline residue that she knew, in the way you know the things that have been burned into you, was going to kill this man inside the next 6 minutes if it hadn't already started working. She reached past Dr. Orr and pulled the line. It happened fast. The motion was clean and certain, the kind of move that doesn't look dramatic but announces itself immediately because of what it stops. The line came free. Mara had it in her hand. The secondary delivery was severed. Orr grabbed her arm. "Security. Get security in here right now." She didn't fight him. She didn't try to explain. She looked at the Admiral's face and watched the faint gray tinge at his lips and said, "He's been dosed. The line was contaminated. You need to start treating for compound inhibition, not cardiac rhythm." "She is done." Orr's voice was tight now, and she heard something in it that she cataloged without processing because there wasn't time. "Get her out." 2 security officers appeared in the doorway within 90 seconds. They were professional, and they were not rough with her, but they were also not listening. She was walked out of Trauma Bay 3 with her hands free, and the pulled IV line bagged as evidence by one of the residents who at least understood that much of proper protocol. The doors closed behind her. She stood in the corridor. One of the security officers, a heavy-set man named Dell, whose name tag she had memorized months ago out of habit, looked at her with something between sympathy and bewilderment. "What happened in there?" "I pulled a contaminated line from a patient who needed it pulled," she said. "And I need someone to call the nursing supervisor and get that bag to the lab before anybody throws it out." Dell glanced at his colleague. His colleague shrugged slightly. "We're going to need you to wait in the conference room," Dell said. She waited. The conference room smelled like burnt coffee and the particular institutional anxiety of a space used primarily for difficult conversations. She sat in a chair and did not look at her phone and did not let herself go back through what she had seen in that bay because there was nothing useful in going back through it yet. She thought about the line. She thought about the residue. She thought about the Admiral's lips. The nursing supervisor, a woman named Gail Prescott, who had 15 years on Mara and the kind of exhausted competence that comes with them, came in 11 minutes later. "Tell me what you did," Gail said. Mara told her. Gail listened without interrupting, which Mara knew from experience meant either that she was being believed or that Gail was organizing her response. When Mara finished, Gail was quiet for a moment. "Orr is furious," Gail said. "I know. He's saying you contaminated the sterile field and violated patient care protocol. The line was already compromised before I touched it." Gail rubbed the back of her neck. "The bag is in the lab. They'll run whatever they run. But Mara—" She paused. "You understand what you did in there. I interrupted a delivery that would have killed that patient. You physically intervened in the care of a patient you were not assigned to, over the objection of the attending physician. That's not a gray area." Mara knew it wasn't a gray area. She had known it before she pulled the line. She had pulled it anyway because there are moments when the only real choice is the one in front of you, and everything else is just the noise you make while deciding. The door opened and Dr. Orr walked in. He looked at her like she was something he had found in an inappropriate location. "This is being handled at the administrative level. You're done here tonight." He didn't look at Gail. He looked at Mara. "Whatever you think you saw in that bay, you're wrong. You panicked. You interfered with the care of a critical patient. And your judgment—" He paused, like he wanted the word to land. "Your judgment is not the kind we have room for at this hospital." "Did anyone pull the line and test it?" Mara asked. Orr's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "The patient is stable. Right now." "The patient," he repeated, with the slow deliberateness of someone who wanted no ambiguity about who was in charge, "is stable. You pulled a line and panicked, and I am telling you that nothing was wrong with it." Mara looked at him for a moment. She had seen, in the corridor outside the bay, during the 90 seconds before security arrived. She had seen Dr. Sebastian Orr reach into the pocket of his coat and remove his phone. She had seen him look at the screen. She had seen his face do something that trauma chiefs' faces did not usually do when a patient was being stabilized. She had seen relief. Not the relief of a physician watching a situation come under control. Something older. Something that had been waiting. She didn't say any of this. She filed it behind her eyes in the place where she kept the things she was still working out how to use. "Okay," she said. Orr left. Gail looked at her for a long moment. "Go home, Mara." "I know." She collected her jacket from her locker. She found her keys. She walked through the ER's side exit into the parking lot, where the March air was cold and clean and smelled like pine resin in elevation. She stood beside her car and breathed it in and thought about the residue on the junction point and the way Orr had looked at his phone and the way the Admiral's lips had looked in the fluorescent light of Trauma Bay 3. She thought about a field hospital, a different bay, different equipment, the same gray at the lips, the same stillness settling in like weather. She thought about 4 minutes. She had been standing in the parking lot for less than 2 minutes when the bay door behind her crashed open and someone shouted. She was already running back before she understood why. The code alarm was coming from Trauma Bay 3. She hit the bay doors and pushed through without slowing, and the room was already crowded with people who had been pulled from other parts of the floor, but she saw the monitor before she saw anything else, and the monitor was showing a rhythm she recognized from the exact worst context she had ever encountered it. Not cardiac failure the way a textbook described it. The specific cascading crash of a cardiovascular system being chemically dismantled. 4 minutes. Maybe less, at this stage. Orr was on the phone in the corner of the room. His back was to the patient. She went to the bed. One of the residents, not Fielding, the other one, a woman named Park who had been in the room earlier, looked at her with wide eyes. "You can't be in here. What do you have running right now?" "She can't be in here." "What's running?" Mara said, not loudly but with a specificity that stopped the question. "Tell me what's in the current line," Park told her. Mara processed the information in about 2 seconds, crossed to the crash cart, and began pulling what she needed with the systematic efficiency of someone who had done this in conditions that made Trauma Bay 3 look like a controlled environment. "Stop," Orr's voice from the corner. He had ended his call. "Stop what you're doing right now." "He's got maybe 3 minutes," Mara said. She was already moving. "The standard protocol isn't going to reach this because it's not a standard event. The compound in that line disrupts the sodium channels differently than—" "Remove her." Orr was walking toward her now. "Somebody remove her from this room." Nobody moved. Later, Park would say she didn't know why she froze. The other resident would say the same. Dell, who had followed Mara back in, would say he had seen something in her face that made him pause. Not hesitation, but the opposite of hesitation. A quality of certainty so complete that stepping in front of it felt like stepping in front of a vehicle. Mara worked. She did not use the standard drug sequence. She used a combination that had no name in any hospital formulary she had ever found, assembled from components that existed in every crash cart, but were not typically combined in this order or at this ratio. The sequence had been shown to her by a Navy flight surgeon in a building that didn't have a number or an address, under conditions she was still not cleared to describe, after 3 members of their team had died from something that the official record said was a training accident. She administered the first component. She administered the second. She waited 4 seconds, exactly 4, because that was the window, and administered the third. The monitor screamed. Then it changed. Not recovery. Not yet. But not the flat, certain terminus that had been building. Something else. A hesitation in the machinery of disaster. "Talk to me," Mara said quietly, to no one and everyone, to the room and the equipment and the man on the table who had no idea what any of this was. "Come on." The rhythm shifted, irregular, struggling, but present. Orr stood at the edge of the room and did not move. His face was doing the thing again, the thing she had seen outside in the parking lot, but with a different valence now. Not relief. Something adjacent to it that lived in darker territory. The monitor stabilized into something that resembled a viable pattern. Park exhaled audibly. Dell made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Mara stepped back from the bed. Her hands were steady. They were always steady when she was working. Afterward was a different matter. She looked at Orr. He was looking at the monitor, at the rhythm on the screen that his expertise told him should not exist after what the Admiral's system had just gone through. He was looking at it the way you look at something you arranged to not survive. "What did you give him?" he said. His voice was careful in a way it had not been careful before. "Something that worked," she said. "You should call the lab. You should also call the people who transferred him here and find out exactly what happened on that plane." He didn't answer. She turned toward the door. "You're terminated," Orr said to her back. "Effective immediately. Don't come back to this hospital." She walked out of the bay and into the corridor and past the nurse's station and out through the side exit into the parking lot again, where the March air was still cold and the pine smell was still there. And she could hear, faintly, from somewhere beyond the lot, the distant sound of vehicles. She looked toward the street. 3 black SUVs moving in from the eastern approach, running dark, no lights except the white of their headlights cutting through the parking lot's edge. They pulled in without hurry and stopped in a loose formation near the hospital's main entrance. Mara stood very still. The door of the lead vehicle opened. A man in a dark jacket stepped out. He was not in uniform, but he moved like someone who had worn one for a long time and would never fully stop wearing it internally. He looked around the parking lot with the systematic efficiency of someone doing a sweep, and his eyes stopped when they reached her. He walked toward her. She didn't move. He stopped about 8 feet away and looked at her with an expression she couldn't entirely classify, recognition, and something heavier underneath it. "Petty Officer Mara Voss," he said. Not a question. She hadn't used that name in 3 years. "We've been looking for you," he said, "for a long time." Behind her, through the bay doors, she could hear the distant, persistent beeping of Admiral Marcus Webb's heart monitor. Still beating, still there. She looked at the man in the dark jacket and said nothing, and in the silence between them, something that had been waiting for 3 years began to move. His name was Garrett Solis, and he showed her a badge before he said anything else, which she appreciated because it meant he understood she wasn't going to respond to authority that didn't identify itself first. Defense Intelligence Agency. A field division she recognized by its structural code even though the badge didn't list it, Because the structural code was something you learned when you worked in spaces that didn't officially exist. And once you learned it, you didn't forget it the way you didn't forget other things from that period of your life. "I need you to come with me," Solis said. "Is that a request?" He considered this with the honesty of someone who had decided not to waste her time. "It's a strong recommendation." She looked at the SUVs. 3 of them, which meant at least 6 personnel, possibly more if they were running tight configurations. Not enough for a hostile extraction, enough for a protective detail around a hospital that had just had an assassination attempt inside it. "The Admiral," she said, "is the reason we're here, yes. He needs to be moved." "That's already in motion." Solis glanced toward the entrance. "But we have a situation inside that's more complicated than the Admiral's location. We need your read on it." She followed him to the lead SUV. A woman in the vehicle's second row shifted to make room without being asked. Late 30s, sharp-eyed, wearing the kind of practical clothing that didn't announce itself. She introduced herself as Agent Danny Reyes and handed Mara a sealed water bottle before saying anything substantive, which was either a calculated rapport gesture or genuine consideration, and Mara didn't particularly care which. "Walk me through what happened in that bay," Reyes said, as Solis took the front passenger seat and the driver pulled the SUV forward to reposition closer to the entrance. Mara walked them through it. She was precise. She didn't editorialize. She described the residue, the junction point, the specific characteristics that had identified the compound to her, the timeline of the delivery relative to when the cardiac event had begun. She described Orr's reaction. She described his phone. She described the relief on his face and what it had shifted into after the resuscitation. Reyes listened without writing anything down, which meant she was either recording or had memory training, probably both. "The compound you identified," Reyes said when Mara finished. "You've seen it before." "Twice." "Where?" Mara looked at her. "You have my file." "I want to hear it from you." She said it simply because there was no point in being oblique about something this woman clearly already knew. "The first time was at a forward operating position in the Karan Valley. There was a strike on a compound we were holding. 3 personnel died in the same pattern I saw on the Admiral tonight. Cardiovascular cascade, too fast for standard intervention. The second time was 18 months later, 2 weeks before my unit was declared combat ineffective, and I was separated from service." Reyes was quiet for a moment. Outside the SUV, 2 agents moved through the hospital's main entrance with the coordinated ease of people who had done this before and had the clearances to do it without stopping to explain themselves to anyone. "Your unit," Reyes said carefully. "Special Reconnaissance Detachment, Task Force Meridian." "Yes." 8 personnel. 8. The number sat in the vehicle with them. "You're aware that the official record lists the unit's dissolution as the result of a training accident and operational restructuring." "I'm aware of what the official record says." Solis turned from the front seat. He had the particular stillness of someone who had been doing this job long enough to know that the next thing he said was going to land hard. "Petty Officer Voss, we have reason to believe the dissolution of Task Force Meridian was not an accident. We have reason to believe it was deliberate. And we have reason to believe that the individual who facilitated the intelligence leak that led to your unit's ambush is the same individual who was in that trauma bay tonight." The parking lot lights buzzed faintly overhead. Somewhere in the hospital, a door opened and closed. "Orr," she said. "His name wasn't Orr 3 years ago," Reyes said. "It was Decker. Major Leonard Decker, Army Medical Corps, attached to Fort Cavell in a liaison capacity during the period when Task Force Meridian was operating out of the valley. He had access to mission schedules, personnel manifests, and the specific routing data for the insertion your unit ran on November 14th. November 14th was not a date she kept in the front of her mind, because the things in the front of her mind were the things she needed to function day to day. November 14th lived somewhere further back, in a place she visited infrequently and left quickly. "He changed his identity," she said. "Complete reconstruction. Medical credentials are legitimate. He did his original residency training under a different name at a program we're still working to fully trace. By the time he surfaced as Sebastian Orr at Vantage Memorial 4 years ago, the paper trail was clean enough that a routine background check didn't catch anything." Mara thought about 4 years. She thought about the fact that she had been working in this hospital for 3 months and had stood within 15 feet of Leonard Decker on at least 11 occasions she could recall without trying hard, passing him in corridors, receiving his assessments in handoff briefings, hearing his voice from behind curtains when he was with other patients. She thought about the fact that she had not recognized him. She had only seen Decker twice. Once in a mission briefing he had attended as a liaison observer. Once at a distance, across a compound, the week before everything ended. He'd been heavier then. Different hair, different bearing. He'd worn the military posture like something external, like a coat. Or wore his authority like it was structural, part of the bone. People changed. She had changed. That was what 3 years of becoming someone else felt like from the inside. You said the assassination attempt on the Admiral was planned from inside this hospital, she said. We've been tracking a network, Solis said. Admiral Webb has been a primary target for approximately 8 months. He's the chair of the Senate subcommittee investigating procurement fraud and defense contracting, specifically related to a series of contracts issued to a holding company called Carver Mast Group. The investigation has been building a case that connects CMG to weapons trafficking, not the kind that ends up in a newspaper, the kind that ends up in places where it shouldn't, delivered through channels that officially don't exist. She knew where he was going before he got there. She knew because she had been in a valley in a country she was not permitted to name, and she had seen things during that deployment that she had subsequently been told, formally and with witnesses present, that she had not seen. Meridian found something, she said. Meridian found a lot of things, Reyes said quietly, and Decker, made sure none of it came back. The weight of it settled in the vehicle, not dramatically. The way weight settles, gradually, completely, until it becomes the thing you're breathing around. He's been here 4 years, Mara said. Why the Admiral? Why now? Webb's investigation crossed a threshold 6 weeks ago. They obtained financial documentation connecting CMG's shell structure directly to payments made to 2 individuals who we believe facilitated the Meridian ambush, or is one of the downstream recipients of those funds. If Webb testifies next month, the chain becomes prosecutable. Solis paused. Tonight was the window. The Admiral's medical transport was rerouted through channels that Orr's network controls, creating the access point. The hospital wasn't chosen randomly. Mara thought about Dorothy Greer, the hospital administrator who had authorized the rapid intake without the usual chain of notification. She thought about this compressed timeline. She thought about a lot of things at once, which was something she'd learned to do in environments where the cost of sequential thinking was too high. The administrator, she said. Reyes and Solis exchanged a look that was brief but legible. Dorothy Greer has had financial contact with a CMG subsidiary for approximately 2 years, Reyes said. We haven't been able to determine whether she understood what she was facilitating or whether she believed it was a routine consulting relationship. Either way, she authorized the reroute. She needs to be out of the building. Already handled. The lead agent from the entrance appeared at Solis's window and spoke to him in a low, rapid exchange. Solis listened, said 2 words Mara couldn't hear through the glass, and turned back. The Admiral is stable and being prepped for transfer to the Federal Medical Unit at Cavell, but the lab just called back on the bag you're pulled. She waited. It's a compound they've never seen before in a civilian context. The preliminary read matches a descriptor in a sealed military toxicology file from 3 years ago. He looked at her directly. The same compound that killed 2 members of Task Force Meridian in the Chiron Valley. The night air pressed against the windows. Somewhere above them, the mountains held their position. I need to go back in, Mara said. That's not... The secondary bag is still in the lab. If Orr has any network access to that department, the evidence can be compromised before it's properly logged. I know where the lab supervisor keeps the after-hours chain of custody documentation, and I know which centrifuge they'll have run the preliminary on. She paused. I also know the hospital's internal layout better than anyone you have with you right now. Reyes looked at Solis. Solis looked at Mara. You're not an agent, he said. No. I'm a nurse who used to be a petty officer who knows what was in that line and who put it there. You can argue the jurisdiction, or you can use what you have. Another exchange of looks. Then Reyes opened the SUV door. Stay within 10 feet of Agent Kowalski, she said, nodding toward a compact, quiet man who had appeared at the vehicle's side without Mara noticing him arrive. You don't go anywhere alone. You don't make any contact with hospital staff without one of us present. And if Orr is in any space you're entering, you stop and you wait. Understood. She got out of the SUV and walked back into the hospital she'd been fired from approximately 22 minutes ago. The ER was quieter than it had been. Trauma Bay 3's doors were closed, and through the narrow window she could see the residual controlled chaos of a space being reset, equipment being wiped down, lines being cataloged, the particular aftermath that looked like cleaning but was actually evidence. Two agents she didn't recognize stood at either side of the bay, which meant Reyes and Solis had more people inside than she'd counted from the parking lot. She moved through the nurses' station without stopping, Kowalski matching her pace half a step behind, and took the east corridor toward the hospital's diagnostic wing. The lab was on the second floor, accessible by a staircase that most staff avoided in favor of the elevator because the staircase was cold and poorly lit. She used the staircase. The lab supervisor was a man named Hector Tron who worked the overnight shift because the overnight shift paid a differential and also because Hector genuinely liked the hours, liked the quiet, liked the fact that nothing much came through after midnight that required him to perform for an audience. He was at his station when she came through the door. He looked at her, then at Kowalski, then back at her with the specific wariness of someone who has processed enough late-night emergencies to know that people appearing in the lab at this hour without announcement were rarely bringing good news. "The bag from Bay 3, she said. "The preliminary run. Where is it?" Hector looked at Kowalski's jacket, at the badge that Kowalski had clipped visibly to his breast pocket. He looked back at Mara. "It's logged. I need it secured in a chain of custody protocol right now. Federal level, not hospital level. Do you have the form?" He did. He had it because Vantage Memorial handled occasional DHS transfers and had the paperwork infrastructure even if it rarely got used. Mara stood at the counter while Hector pulled the form and the sample bag and began the process of transferring documentation. She watched his hands because his hands were doing what needed to be done, and watching the work kept her from thinking about other things. The door behind her opened. She turned expecting another agent. It was Dr. Sebastian Orr. He was still in his coat. He had his hospital badge on. He looked at Hector, at the sample bag on the counter, at the federal chain of custody form that was currently about 60 seconds from being completed, and his face did the calculation in real time. He looked at Mara. "You can't be in this building," he said. "I'm aware of what I can and can't do," she said. "Hector, keep going." Hector kept going, though his pen speed had changed. Orr stepped into the lab. Kowalski shifted to position himself between Orr and the counter without making it look like that was what he was doing. Orr registered this. His eyes moved to Kowalski's badge. "Whatever you think is happening here," Orr said, with the controlled steadiness of someone who had survived previous versions of this kind of moment, "you're operating on the word of a nurse who panicked during a critical procedure and has been dismissed for cause. Anything she's told you about that bag is contaminated by her emotional response to being removed." "Hector," Mara said. Hector initialed the final line and slid the form across the counter to Kowalski without looking at Orr. Kowalski picked up the sample bag, looked at Orr with the particular neutrality of a professional who had been in worse rooms than this. "Sir, I'm going to need you to stay in this space until my colleagues arrive. You have no authority over hospital staff on hospital grounds. Agent Solis has a federal warrant that covers this facility and its personnel, issued 40 minutes ago." Kowalski removed his phone and sent a message with one thumb. "Someone will be here in about 2 minutes. You're welcome to wait." Orr stood very still. Mara watched him. She was looking for the thing she'd seen in the parking lot, the thing she'd seen when the monitor showed the Admiral's rhythm coming back. The particular quality of a man who had managed situations like this before and was currently deciding which of his available options was least bad. His hand moved toward his coat pocket. Kowalski said very quietly, "Please don't." Orr's hand stopped. The lab hummed. The centrifuge in the back turned. Hector had gone very still at his station, the form of a man trying to become furniture. The door opened and 2 agents came in, followed by Reyes, who took in the room in about 1 second and stepped to a position that completed a triangle around Orr without any of them having to consult each other about it. "Dr. Orr," Reyes said, "my name is Agent Reyes. I need to ask you to come with me." He went. Not because he wanted to, because the calculation had resolved, and this was what it came out to, and men like Orr, men like Decker, were careful enough to know when the moment for a different kind of action had passed, and the moment for lawyer and silence had arrived. He walked out of the lab between 2 federal agents. At the door, he stopped. He turned back once and looked at Mara. His face was doing something she couldn't fully categorize. It wasn't rage. It was more precise than rage. "You should have died in that valley," he said. She held his gaze. Her hands were steady. "I know," she said. The door closed. Hector exhaled like a man who had been holding air in reserve. He looked at Mara. He looked at where Orr had been standing. He looked at the empty space above the counter where the sample bag wasn't anymore. "Do I want to know?" he said. "What was in that bag?" "No," she said. "You don't." She left the lab and walked back down the cold staircase and out into the east corridor, where the hospital continued its night around her, monitors beeping, a cart moving somewhere, the distant murmur of a shift change briefing down the hall. Normal sounds. The sounds of a place trying to be what it was supposed to be. Reyes found her in the corridor 3 minutes later. "He's in custody," Reyes said. "Temporary hold while we process the warrant and get federal transport. He hasn't said anything yet." "He won't say anything," Mara said. "Not tonight. He's deciding what he can trade and what he needs to hold." "That's our read too." Reyes fell into step beside her, and they walked without particular destination down the corridor in the direction of nowhere specific. The administrator, Greer, was detained at her home 40 minutes ago. She said 4 words when the agents arrived. Then she asked for a lawyer. That means she knew what she was doing. Or she knew enough to know she was in trouble. Reyes was quiet for a moment. "You handled yourself well in there. The lab. The timing on the custody form." Mara didn't respond to the assessment because the assessment wasn't what this was about. "The Admiral," she said. "Is he talking?" "He's awake. He's at Cavell. The medical team there has the compound profile now. They're adjusting the treatment protocol." Reyes paused. He asked who stabilized him. When they told him it was a nurse from the ER, he wanted her name. Mara said nothing. "We told him your name," Reyes said. "Your real name." The corridor stretched ahead of them. The fluorescent lights were the particular shade of institutional white that made everyone look slightly tired, slightly exposed. Mara thought about Admiral Marcus Webb lying in a room at Cavell, asking for the name of the person who had reached into the machinery of his death and pulled something back. She thought about a room in a different facility, years ago, where she had not been fast enough, where the machinery had gone where it went, and she had stood in the aftermath with nothing but her hands, and the specific permanent education of having tried everything and still failed. "My team," she said. "Task Force Meridian, the 8 of us." She stopped walking. Reyes stopped beside her. "The official record says training accident. You know that's wrong. You've known it was wrong." Reyes didn't deny it. "How long?" Mara said. The word hung there. "The investigation into CMG's network has been running for 14 months, Reyes said carefully. Certain aspects of the Meridian case were incorporated into that investigation approximately 9 months ago when a financial thread connected Decker's payments to CMG's subsidiary structure." 9 months. Mara thought about 9 months, what that interval meant, what it had contained. "You knew where he was," she said. "You knew he was here." Reyes was quiet for a moment too long. "We were building a prosecutable case," she said. "Moving on him before the financial chain was fully documented would have—" "He tried to kill a United States Admiral tonight," Mara said, "in a hospital, with something he used to kill my team." "I know." "He's been 40 miles from a federal installation for 4 years." "I know." Reyes said it without the lawyer language, without the institutional framing. She said it like someone who understood exactly what those words contained and was not going to pretend they contained less. "I know, Voss." The corridor was quiet around them. "What happens now?" Mara said. "We move through the warrant process. The lab evidence clears federal chain of custody by morning. Decker, or, goes to federal holding. We expand the warrant to include everything at this hospital connected to tonight, which based on what we have already is going to be significant." Reyes looked at her. "And we need you, not as a civilian witness, as someone with direct operational knowledge of Task Force Meridian, the Karen Valley incidents, and what you saw tonight." "I'm a nurse," Mara said. "I got fired about 45 minutes ago." "You're a decorated Navy petty officer with classified operational experience who just saved a federal official's life using techniques that aren't in any civilian medical manual." Reyes held her gaze. You're the only person still alive who was in that valley and can speak to what Meridian found. The weight of the 8 names sat where it always sat, not loudly, but consistently. I want a record, Mara said. Official. I want it on paper what happened to my team, not training accident, not operational restructuring, what actually happened. That's part of what tonight starts. Not starts, completes. She looked at Reyes without hostility and without softness, just with the particular clarity of someone who had been waiting 3 years for the right moment to put a very specific set of words in the right place. This doesn't start tonight. This has been running since November 14th, 3 years ago. Tonight is where it ends. Reyes nodded slowly. Then let's make sure we end it correctly. They walked back toward the main entrance together. Through the bay windows, Mara could see the SUVs still positioned in their configuration, engines idling, the quiet machinery of a federal operation settling into the logistics of what came next. She thought about Orr in federal custody. She thought about the sample bag moving through chain of custody. She thought about the Admiral at Cavell, awake, asking for her name. She thought about 8 people. She thought about November 14th. She pulled out her phone to confirm her car was still where she'd parked it and found a message waiting. Not from any of the contacts in her phone. A number she didn't recognize, no name attached, received 4 minutes ago while she'd been in the corridor with Reyes. 3 words. She's not safe. She stood in the entrance corridor of the hospital and looked at the message and felt the particular cold that had nothing to do with the mountain air outside. The number resolved to a relay, bounced, untraceable in any quick sense. Someone with access to her personal number. Someone who knew she was here tonight. Someone who wanted her to know that the circle around whatever had happened in Trauma Bay 3 was larger than one trauma chief in federal custody and one administrator in a lawyer's silence. She's not safe. Not, you're not safe. Not a threat toward her. She. Mara looked around the entrance corridor, at the agents positioned near the doors, at the nurses' station visible down the hall, at the bay window where the SUVs waited. She thought about who in this hospital tonight was a she that someone believed needed a warning. She thought about Hector Tran's lab, where there was now a completed chain of custody form that connected a specific compound to a specific federal investigation. She thought about the lab supervisor's assistant, a young woman named Petra, who worked the early overnight, who had been at the secondary station when Mara came in, who had been very quiet, very still, who had watched the whole exchange without saying a word and had left the lab through the back corridor door approximately 2 minutes before Orr arrived. The door through which, if you knew the building, you could reach the parking structure in under 4 minutes, or reach the server room where hospital administrative records were stored, or reach the secondary communications closet where the hospital's external line routing was managed. Mara was already moving before she'd finished the thought, and behind her she heard Reyes call her name, and she didn't stop. She went through the back corridor at a run, not a sprint, controlled, quiet, the kind of pace that covered ground without announcing itself, which was something you learned when announcing yourself had consequences. Kowalski was behind her within 4 seconds. She heard him, didn't look back. Reyes was further back, on her radio, her voice clipped and rapid in the way of someone redirecting personnel who were already in motion. The back corridor ran parallel to the diagnostic wing and connected to the hospital's service infrastructure, a long institutional artery of beige walls and overhead conduit that the public never saw and most clinical staff rarely used after hours. The lights here were on a motion sensor circuit that flickered on in sections as she moved, which meant if Petra had come through recently, the far sections would still be lit. They were. Mara slowed at the junction. 3 directions. Left was the parking structure access. Straight ahead was the server room and administrative records. Right was the communications closet, but also the secondary exit to the loading dock, which opened to the street. She stood at the junction for 2 seconds and did not guess. She thought about what the text message had said, who it had been sent to, and what information would be most valuable to protect or destroy right now, tonight, before the federal warrant scope became fully operational. The server room held the electronic administrative records, but those records were already subject to the warrant. Destroying them electronically required access and time and generated logs. The communications closet was different. The external line routing managed there handled the hospital's incoming and outgoing communications, including the switchboard logs that would show who had called whom and when. Switchboard logs were not electronic medical records. They existed in a different administrative category that the current warrant's language might not explicitly cover, and someone who understood that distinction could argue for their exclusion later. She went right. The communications closet was 60 feet down the right corridor, behind a door marked Telecom, Authorized Personnel, which in her 3 months here she had opened exactly once to retrieve a misrouted external line connection for a patient in long-term care. The lock was a basic keycard. Staff-level access. She still had her badge. Firing her hadn't deactivated her credentials yet, because that happened in HR during business hours, and it was currently 2:15 in the morning. She swiped the card. The lock disengaged. She pushed the door open. Petra was inside. She was 24, slight, with the particular stillness of someone who has been caught and is deciding in real time whether to run or hold. She was standing at the wall panel where the external line logs were stored. Physical printout backups, thermal paper, the kind of secondary system that existed because someone in hospital administration 15 years ago had insisted on analog redundancy and no one had ever bothered to remove it. She had 3 rolled logs in her hand. She looked at Mara. Mara looked at the logs. "Put them down," Mara said. Petra's eyes moved to Kowalski in the doorway. She calculated. The calculation took about 2 seconds and came out the wrong way. She lunged for the secondary exit at the back of the closet, a narrow door that Mara hadn't known was there. Kowalski moved faster than she expected from him, cutting the angle and reaching the secondary door before Petra did. He didn't grab her. He simply stood in front of the door with the particular solidity of someone who had decided this was the position and was not revising it. Petra stopped. She still had the logs. "Those go down on the floor," Kowalski said. Slowly. Petra's jaw was tight. She was breathing fast but controlled. Not panicking, calculating even now, looking at the geometry of the room for something Mara couldn't see. "There's nowhere to go," Mara said. "And those logs are federal evidence under an active warrant. If you damage or destroy them, that's a separate charge from whatever you're already looking at." "I don't know what you're talking about," Petra said. "You were in the lab when I came in with the sample bag. You left before Orr arrived. You sent a text to a number connected to someone in this network, and that person sent a warning to my phone." Mara kept her voice even, factual. "That's what I know right now. There's probably more." Petra's eyes were moving, still calculating. "The person who sent the warning to your phone," Mara said. "They said she's not safe. They meant you." She let that settle for a moment. "Whoever you're connected to, they were warning me about you because they knew you were going to be caught, not protecting you, flagging you as a loose end." Something shifted in Petra's face. Fractional. The kind of shift that happened when a calculation produced a result you hadn't wanted. Reyes appeared in the doorway behind Kowalski, slightly winded, her radio in hand. Petra set the logs on the floor. She didn't say anything else. She sat down against the wall with her knees up and her hands visible, which was the posture of someone who had decided that cooperation, at this point, was its own kind of currency. Reyes called it in, and 2 agents arrived within 4 minutes. The logs were bagged. Petra was walked out with a hand on her elbow, not rough, not gentle, the neutral grip of procedure. Reyes stood in the telecom closet with Mara and looked at the wall panel where the physical logs had been stored. "Who sent the text?" Mara asked. "We're running the relay now." Reyes scrolled something on her phone. "It's going to take time. The bounce architecture is—" Her phone rang. She looked at the screen. The look on her face was brief and readable. Something had changed. She answered and listened for approximately 15 seconds. "When?" she said. She listened again. "How compromised?" More listening. "Copy that. We're en route." She ended the call and looked at Mara with the expression of someone reassessing the scope of what they were dealing with. "The Admiral," Mara said. "He's alive," Reyes said immediately, which answered the question Mara hadn't asked out loud but had been broadcasting. "But the medical team at Cavell has reported an anomaly in his current status. The compound's doing something they haven't seen before in the treatment protocol they're running. His rhythm is destabilizing again." Mara thought about the compound, about what she knew of its mechanism, the information that lived in her from the valley, not from a manual, not from a database, from watching it happen in real time, and from what the flight surgeon had told her afterward in the hours when they were still trying to understand what they'd been hit with. "The standard antiarrhythmic protocol isn't going to hold him," she said. "What are they running?" "I don't know the specifics, Get me someone on the phone who does. Reyes looked at her for a fraction of a second. Then she redialed. She handed Mara the phone. The person on the other end was a physician named Calvert, Fort Cavell's senior medical officer, whose voice had the specific quality of someone who was very good competence encounter something outside its map. Mara asked him 3 questions. He answered them. She processed the answers and understood the picture. They had stabilized the immediate rhythm, but the compound's secondary mechanism was interfering with the myocardial response at the cellular level, which meant the standard intervention was suppressing the symptom while the underlying damage continued. You need to stop the beta blockade, she said. I know that's counterintuitive given the rhythm presentation, but the beta blockade is competing with the cellular repair mechanism in this specific compound. You pull it, the rhythm looks worse for about 90 seconds, and then the endogenous repair process gets the space it needs. A pause on the line. That is significantly outside standard protocol for this rhythm profile, Calvert said. I know. If the endogenous process doesn't respond, then you're back to the standard protocol and you've lost 90 seconds. But the standard protocol isn't working, and he has approximately 3 hours before the compound's secondary mechanism does damage that isn't reversible. She said this without drama because it wasn't dramatic. It was just true. The way the things she'd learned in the valley were true, paid for at a price that had nothing to do with drama. That's my read, Dr. Calvert. The decision is yours. Another pause. Longer. How do you know this? Calvert said. I watched it kill 2 people, she said, and I watched 1 person survive it. She handed the phone back to Reyes. Reyes finished the call and stood for a moment in the telecom closet under the fluorescent light. Is he going to do it? Mara asked. He's consulting his team, Reyes said, which is what he should do. She looked at Mara. We need to get you to Cavell. I'm a fired ER nurse on hospital grounds I'm not supposed to be on. You're the only person in this state who's treated this compound in an active patient and can communicate the mechanism to a clinical team in real time. Reyes put her phone in her pocket. Your employment status is a paperwork problem. The Admiral's heart is not a paperwork problem. They moved. The drive to Fort Cavell was 40 miles on a state highway that ran through the mountain dark with no traffic at this hour, except the occasional long-haul truck running west. Solis drove. Reyes was on the phone for most of the drive, and Mara listened to the shape of the conversations without the words. Personnel movements, warrant extensions, something about a federal judge being woken up at 2:40 in the morning, which meant the scope of what was being built was expanding faster than even the last 90 minutes had suggested. She looked at the mountains through the window. They were present even at night, defined by the absence of stars at their ridgelines. She had driven this road exactly once before, the morning after she'd taken the job at Vantage Memorial, orienting herself to the geography of the new life she was building. That drive had felt like something tentative. This one felt like something else. Kowalski was in the back seat beside her. He'd been quiet since the telecom closet. He said, without preamble, "The text you got. She's not safe. You moved on it immediately." "Yes. Most people would have shown it to us first. There wasn't time to do both." He nodded slowly. Not approving, just registering. 3 years undercover as a civilian, that's a long time to run a different life. "I wasn't undercover," she said. "I was just living." He didn't respond to that because there wasn't a useful response to it, and she appreciated that he understood this. Fort Cavell's medical facility was a low complex inside the installation's perimeter, functionally separate from the main base operations, staffed around the clock, because the operational tempo at Cavell didn't permit gaps. They were cleared through 2 checkpoints. Solis had called ahead and walked into the facility's clinical wing past personnel who registered their presence with the practice-neutral efficiency of people accustomed to unusual arrivals at unusual hours. Dr. Calvert met them in the corridor outside the ICU bay where the Admiral was being held. He was 50, compact, with the demeanor of someone who ran on precise information and became visibly uncomfortable without it. He looked at Mara with the specific expression of a physician encountering a clinical input that his training hadn't prepared him for, and his judgment told him was probably correct. "We pulled the beta blockade 8 minutes ago," he said. "The rhythm deteriorated as you predicted." "How far?" "Far enough that 2 of my team thought we were looking at terminal cascade." He paused. "Then it shifted." She waited. His endogenous response is activating. It's not stable yet, but the pattern is moving in the right direction. Calvert looked at her the way people sometimes looked at her when the thing she'd said turned out to be true. Not with gratitude exactly, but with the recalibration that true things imposed. I need to understand what you know about this compound. I'll tell you everything that's relevant to treating him, she said. Some of it isn't in any document you're going to find. I understand that. Then let's work. They went into a small conference room adjacent to the ICU, and Mara talked while Calvert and his senior resident, a woman named Dr. Anaya, who said very little but wrote everything down with a speed and accuracy that Mara found steadying, absorbed the information. She described the compound's mechanism as she understood it. The dual-phase action, the initial sodium channel disruption that presented as cardiac arrest, and the secondary cellular interference that the first phase masked, the specific window in which the endogenous repair process could be supported versus suppressed by standard intervention. She described what the flight surgeon had told her. She described the 2 deaths and the 1 survival and what the differences had been. It took 31 minutes. When she finished, Calvert sat for a moment with his hands flat on the table. This wasn't developed for general use, he said. No. This was designed for a specific application. Yes. He looked at the table. Someone developed a compound specifically to kill people in a way that looked like natural cardiac events. And tested it, she said, because that was the part that lived in her. 3 years ago, in a valley. The room was quiet. Anaya looked up from her notes. She was perhaps 30, with the particular expression of a young physician encountering the intersection of medicine and things that medicine was not supposed to touch. She didn't say anything. She just looked at Mara and then back at her notes and kept writing. Calvert stood. I need to get back to him. We'll run the supportive protocol you described and monitor the cellular markers. He paused at the door. You should know, when he stabilized earlier and asked for your name, he also said something to the attending nurse. He said, make sure she's here when I wake up. He left. Mara sat in the conference room for a moment after Calvert and Anaya were gone. Reyes was outside in the corridor. She could hear her on the phone again, a different call now. The tone had changed. Something in the information stream had accelerated. She thought about the Admiral asking for her name, about him saying, make sure she's here. She thought about what that meant in the larger architecture of the night. Not the personal weight of it, but the operational weight. An admiral with the specific authority Marcus Webb carried, requesting her presence, was not nothing. It was not a small thing. It was the kind of thing that moved the machinery of official recognition in directions that 3 years of civilian life had closed off. She thought about her team. She thought about November 14th. She was still sitting there when Reyes opened the door. Her face had changed again. The controlled urgency that had been operating on a frequency just below visible all night had surfaced fully now. We have a problem, Reyes said. Tell me. The relay on the text message resolved. She came into the room and closed the door. The number traces to a burner that was activated 6 days ago. Last known ping location was this installation, Fort Cavell, approximately 3 hours before the Admiral's transport was rerouted to Vantage Memorial. Mara went very still. The text warning you about Petra was sent from inside this base, Reyes said, which means someone here knew tonight was coming before we did, and instead of reporting through channels, they sent a 3-word text to your personal number. Someone who knows me, Mara said, or knows of you, knows your number, knows you were at Vantage Memorial. Reyes looked at her steadily. We're running personnel access logs for the time window, but Cavell has 1,100 assigned personnel and the civilian contractor roster on top of that. Mara thought about who would have her number. Who would know she was at that hospital? Who would know enough about tonight to send a warning, but not enough, or not in a position, to stop it through official channels? She thought about the people she had trusted in a previous life and what had happened to them. There's someone else, she said slowly. Someone inside who tried to warn us without exposing themselves. Yes. Which means there's someone inside who isn't part of the network but knows about it. Yes. And whoever they are, they know where I am right now. Reyes didn't answer, which was its own kind of answer. Mara stood up from the table. The facility corridor outside the conference room was quiet. Nighttime quiet, the reduced personnel quiet of an installation running its overnight skeleton. 2 of Solis's agents were positioned near the ICU entrance. Kowalski was visible further down the corridor, talking to a uniformed MP. She walked to the ICU bay door and looked through the window at Admiral Marcus Webb. He looked smaller in the bed than she'd expected. The monitors around him were a landscape of data, rhythm, pressure, oxygenation, the compound-specific markers that Calvert's team was now tracking with the protocol she'd given them. His chest moved. Regular, not perfect, but present. He was alive because she had been in that corridor with that bag of saline at that specific moment. She was in that corridor because of a miscommunication about a runner. The runner had been pulled to a code. She thought about the compound in the line. She thought about Orr, Decker, and his 4 years of careful reinvention. She thought about Dorothy Greer's 4 words and her lawyer. She thought about Petra on the floor of the telecom closet with her knees up. She thought about the 8 names she carried and the fact that now, for the first time in 3 years, there was a federal warrant, a chain of custody form, a clinical record, and a living admiral who had asked for her name. The machinery was moving, slowly, imperfectly, with all the friction that large structures generated when they began to turn, but moving. Behind her, Reyes's phone rang again. Mara heard her answer, heard the shift in her breathing, fast, controlled, the sound of new information arriving with weight. She turned. Reyes had walked several feet down the corridor. Her back was half turned. Her free hand was pressed flat against her thigh, which was what she did, Mara had noticed, when she was managing her reaction to something. Reyes ended the call and walked back. Orr is in federal transport, she said, en route to the holding facility in Denver. And? Reyes looked at her. The transport vehicle's tracking signal dropped 4 minutes ago, outside of Harlan, on the state highway. Mara looked at her. We have 2 agents in that vehicle, Reyes said. We have no communication. The highway patrol unit we dispatched found the vehicle stopped on the shoulder. She paused. Empty. All 3 occupants. Gone. The ICU monitors beeped their steady rhythm behind the glass. Mara looked at the corridor, at the agents near the entrance, at Kowalski, who was already moving toward them, his face having processed Reyes's expression from 30 feet away and drawn the correct conclusion. Decker was out. Not escaped, extracted. Which meant the network was bigger than tonight, bigger than Vantage Memorial, bigger than one administrator's payments, and one lab technician's panicked attempt to destroy a phone log. It meant there were people outside this building right now who had the resources and the coordination to lift a federal prisoner from a moving vehicle on a dark mountain highway. And it meant that the only witness who could speak to what Task Force Meridian had found in the Caron Valley, the only surviving member, was currently standing in a military medical facility with exactly the personnel Solis had brought, 2 MPs, and whatever the installation's overnight security complement looked like. Reyes's hand was on her radio. Solis appeared from the direction of the entrance at a controlled run, which was a specific quality of movement that said everything without saying anything. We're locking down the facility, he said. Decker has people outside, Mara said. We know. He knows I'm here. We know that too. Solis looked at her with the expression of someone who had moved past the phase where concealing assessments from her served any purpose. He also knows what you know, what you told Calvert tonight, what you can testify to. She understood what he was saying. She was not collateral anymore. She had stopped being collateral the moment she walked into Trauma Bay 3. She was now the thread, the specific living thread that connected the Caron Valley to a Senate subcommittee investigation, to a federal warrant, to a clinical record that documented a classified compound being used on a sitting admiral. Pull the thread, the whole structure unraveled. She looked at the ICU window, at Marcus Webb's monitors, at the rhythm that was still present, still moving, still doing what it was supposed to do because 90 seconds in a trauma bay had made a different decision than the one Decker had planned. What do you need from me? She asked. We need you to stay in this building, Solis said. Decker has people who can get into a federal transport vehicle on a highway at night, she said. What makes you confident about this building? It was not a hostile question. It was a tactical one, and Solis received it as such. He didn't answer it immediately, which was honest, because there wasn't a fully satisfying answer. Cavell was a military installation with perimeter security, but perimeter security had gaps, and a network that had operated undetected for 3 years while a federal investigation ran parallel to it for 14 months was not a network that struggled with gaps. The lights in the corridor flickered. 1 second, 2. Then they came back. Kowalski and Reyes both looked up at the same moment. The two agents near the ICU entrance had their hands at their sides in the particular posture of people who had moved from ready to something more specific. The facility's intercom clicked. A voice, the overnight duty officer, controlled, terse, said 4 words that reorganized the room. "We have a breach." And somewhere down the corridor, past the agents, past the checkpoint that was supposed to be sealed, a door opened that should not have opened, and in the space where the nighttime quiet of Fort Cavell's medical wing had been, there was now a different kind of silence, the kind that preceded specific, directed action from people who had come here for one reason. Solis drew his weapon. Mara looked at the ICU door. At the Admiral behind the glass, alive, monitored, the one person whose survival and testimony could end what November 14th had started. She looked at the corridor where the door had opened. She made a decision in the way she made decisions, which was all at once and without the comfort of certainty, and she moved. She went through the ICU door first because the Admiral was the target, and the ICU door was the thing between the target and whatever had just come through the breach. And there was no version of the next 60 seconds in which she stood in the corridor and waited to see how the geometry resolved. The bay was dim, nighttime clinical lighting, the kind that kept the room functional without disrupting the patient's rest cycle. 2 monitors, a ventilatory support unit that wasn't currently in use, a crash cart that she cataloged automatically without meaning to. The Admiral was in the bed, eyes closed, chest moving in the irregular but present rhythm that Calvert's adjusted protocol had produced. She went to the far side of the bed, putting the bed and the Admiral between herself and the door, and looked at the room's physical options. 1 door in, the one she'd come through. 1 window, exterior, ground floor, locked with a security bar. A utility panel on the east wall. A supply closet she'd clocked during the conference room conversation when Calvert had been talking about the facility's layout. She went to the supply closet and opened it. Standard contents, replacement IV supplies, backup monitoring leads, a sharps container, a locked medication drawer she didn't have the key for, a crash cart supplement kit on the bottom shelf. She took what she could use and went back to the Admiral's bedside. Behind her, through the door, she could hear the facility's corridor, movement, voices at the edge of audibility, the specific acoustic texture of a space that had reorganized itself around a threat. 2 controlled bursts of sound that she identified without wanting to identify them. Then quiet. The bad kind of quiet, not the resolved kind. The Admiral opened his eyes. He looked at the ceiling first, then at the room, then at her. He had the orientation of a man who had woken in field conditions before and knew better than to move quickly until he understood his situation. "You're the nurse," he said. His voice was rougher than she'd expected, deep, abraded at the edges, the voice of someone whose system had been through something. "Yes." "Voss?" "Yes." He looked at the door, at the expression on her face. He processed what he was seeing with the speed of someone whose professional life had trained him to read threat assessment in other people's posture. "What's happening?" he said. "A breach in the facility. Ore was extracted from federal transport. His people are here." He was quiet for 3 seconds. "Can you move me?" "Not without knowing where the breach personnel are and whether there's a secure path. Not yet." "Then what are we doing?" "We're waiting for about 90 seconds while I figure out what we have to work with," she said. "And you're staying in that bed." He looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man accustomed to being the decision-maker in rooms like this one and finding the adjustment uncomfortable. "How many are we dealing with?" "Unknown. At least 1 breach point. Solis has agents in the corridor. The MPs—" She stopped because the door opened. Kowalski came in fast, turned to check the room, and pulled the door closed behind him with the particular efficiency of someone reducing sight lines. "2 individuals through the east checkpoint," he said, moving to the window to check the exterior. "One is down in the corridor. Agent Park got him. The other broke left toward the service wing." He looked at the window. "Exterior perimeter has 2 vehicles we can't account for. Solis is calling for backup from the main base." "How long?" 7 minutes, maybe 8. 8 minutes was a long time in a room with 1 exit. She looked at the Admiral, at his monitors, at the IV line running the supportive protocol Calvert had set up. She thought about the compound, its second phase mechanism, The window she'd described to Calvert. The Admiral had approximately 2 hours before the cellular damage curve became irreversible. That window didn't change because someone had breached the east checkpoint. The service wing, she said. Where does it connect? Runs along the back of the medical facility and ties into the supply dock, which connects to the main installation's logistics corridor. He understood where she was going. It's a path out if the exterior vehicles are watching the front approach. Can you get Solis on that frequency? Kowalski was already on his radio, low-voiced, and in 30 seconds had the map of it. Solis, 2 agents, the downed breach personnel in the corridor, the second individual somewhere in the service wing, exterior vehicles at the north and west approaches. The east approach was currently unaccounted for. Reyes is in the service wing, Kowalski said. She went after the second individual. Mara looked at the Admiral. He was watching her with the particular quality of attention she'd noticed sometimes in people who had spent careers in command. Not passive, not anxious, just completely present and processing everything in the room without broadcasting what they were doing with it. The service wing access, she said. Is there a lock we can trip from this side? Kowalski checked his phone. The facility schematic Solis had pushed to the team when they arrived. There's a magnetic lock on the service corridor junction, controlled from the duty officer station, which is where right now. Locked down per the breach protocol. Can Solis reach the duty officer? He was already calling it through. The answer came back in 40 seconds. Yes, the duty officer could remotely engage the magnetic lock, sealing the service wing junction. It would also seal Reyes inside the service wing with the second breach individual, which was not a clean solution. Reyes, Kowalski said on the radio. We're looking at sealing the junction. Talk to me. Her voice came back, controlled and slightly winded. I have him in the storage bay off the service wing. He's not going anywhere. Seal it. Kowalski relayed to Solis. 20 seconds later, the distant mechanical thump of a magnetic lock engaging moved through the wall. The corridor on the other side of the ICU door went quiet. Not the bad quiet, the resolved kind. Mara let out a breath she'd been managing for several minutes. The Admiral, she noticed, had not made a sound through any of it. He had simply lain in the bed and tracked the situation with his eyes, his monitors keeping their imperfect but present rhythm. Backup from the main base is 4 minutes out, Kowalski said. She nodded. She pulled a chair to the side of the Admiral's bed and sat in it, because she had been moving for approximately 3 hours, and her body had an opinion about this, which she acknowledged briefly and then set aside. The Admiral looked at her. How long have you been running? He asked. She didn't think he meant tonight. 3 years. Meridian. She looked at him. You know about Meridian. I know why I was on that plane, he said. I know what my investigation found. And I know that what it found intersected with something that happened 3 years ago in a valley I wasn't supposed to know about. He was quiet for a moment. I know 8 people went in and 1 came out, and the record says it was an accident. She held his gaze and said nothing. I'm sorry, he said. Not the reflexive sorry of someone filling silence. The specific sorry of a person who understood what they were attaching it to. What we need, she said, is for you to survive the next 2 hours and get to a point where you can say what you just said on record. He nodded slowly. Then that's what I'll do. The backup arrived in 5 minutes and 40 seconds, which was slower than promised and faster than she'd managed to expect. 12 MPs in 2 vehicles through the main installation entrance, coordinated with Solis, sweeping the exterior and securing the north and west approach vehicles, both empty by the time they reached them, which meant the exterior elements of Decker's network had read the situation and moved. The second breach individual was extracted from the storage bay where Reyes had penned him, a civilian contractor ID in his wallet, which meant the investigation into Cavell's contractor roster had just become significantly more urgent. He said nothing at processing. His hands, Kowalski noted in his incident report, had the specific callus pattern of someone with tactical training, which was not on his contractor employment profile. Reyes had a bruised forearm and a torn sleeve and the expression of someone who had done what needed doing and was going to be annoyed about the sleeve later. Decker, she said to Mara, in the corridor outside the sealed ICU, where the overhead lights had returned to full, and the quiet had settled into something that felt like aftermath rather than anticipation. We'll find him. How far does his network go? That's what the next 72 hours look like, Reyes said. The phone logs from Vantage Memorial, the CMG financial thread, The contractor ID we just pulled, the relay on your text message. We have enough to pull a very large thread. Mara thought about the telecom closet, about Petra on the floor, about Orr, Decker, in the back of a federal transport vehicle on a mountain highway, and what it had taken to get him out of it, and what that meant about the depth of what had been built. He's been doing this for 14 years, she said, minimum. His identity reconstruction predates Fort Cavell. The CMG relationship predates the investigation. We know. He's not alone and he's not improvising. Whoever his people are, they had an extraction plan on standby for tonight. Also know. Then you know he has somewhere to go. Reyes looked at her with the expression of someone who had been thinking the same thing and was not happy about it. We have alerts at every transport hub within 300 miles. His face is in the federal system under both identities. Every agency that has any interest in the CMG investigation has been notified in the last 40 minutes. It was comprehensive. It was also, Mara thought, the kind of comprehensive that a man who had evaded detection for 3 years while an investigation ran 14 months parallel to him might have anticipated. She said this to Reyes. Reyes looked at the floor for a moment. Yes, she said. The night moved forward. Fort Cavell's medical facility reopened its full operational status by 4:30 in the morning, the breach contained, the damage assessed. The Admiral was moved to a more secure interior room, and Calvert's team confirmed at 5 a.m. that the compound's secondary mechanism had peaked and the cellular repair process was proceeding. His rhythm was ugly, irregular in ways that would need monitoring for weeks, but the curve had turned. Morris sat in the small waiting area outside the new room and drank bad coffee from a machine and felt the specific exhaustion of a night that had gone on significantly longer than nights were supposed to. At 6:15, Reyes came and sat beside her. We found the transport vehicle's route deviation, Reyes said. The extraction happened at a switchback 4 miles outside Harlan. Coordinated. Someone with access to the vehicle's GPS signal triggered a route flag that slowed the transport for a supposed road hazard check. 90-second window. One of the agents in the vehicle. One of the agents in the vehicle, Reyes confirmed. Agent Tully. 6 years at DIA, clean record, recently transferred to the Cavell-adjacent field office. She paused. His employment file has 3 references from personnel connected to Fort Cavell's contractor management division. One of those references is the same individual whose ID we pulled from your second breach contact tonight. The thread. The very large thread. Tully is in the wind with Decker, Mara said. We believe so. She thought about 6 years. A clean record. The specific patience of building something that looked exactly like what it claimed to be. What about Greer and Orr's resources at the hospital, she said. The financial documentation. The warrant team has been at Vantage Memorial since 3 a.m. Reyes pulled out her phone and scrolled to something. What they found is... She paused in a way that was not a natural conversational pause. Larger than we anticipated. The CMG payments to Greer were one stream. There are 4 additional streams connected to Vantage Memorial personnel and infrastructure over the past 3 years. 2 are financial, staff members on supplementary payment structures that appear on the surface as professional consulting fees. 2 are operational, equipment procurement routes that went through CMG subsidiaries at inflated costs, with the differential moving into accounts connected to the network. Mara thought about 3 years. About Vantage Memorial as a location, not just a hospital. A waypoint. A node in something larger, positioned near Fort Cavell, inside the community that served the installation, staffed over time with careful placements. He built it, she said. While he was hiding in it, he built it into something. That's our current read. How many people in that hospital are part of this? 2 confirmed, 3 suspected, several under review. Reyes put her phone away. Mara, I need to tell you something directly. She waited. The warrant documentation we're building right now, the compound evidence, the chain of custody from the lab, the breach tonight, Tully, the CMG financial architecture, it's substantial. It's the kind of case that, when it's complete, doesn't leave people a lot of room. She looked at her steadily. But Decker is not in custody, and the network is larger than we thought, which means the case is more complex and the timeline for prosecution is longer. You're telling me this isn't over tonight. I'm telling you this isn't over in a week, Reyes said. I'm telling you this is going to take months to fully prosecute. I'm telling you that in the meantime, the case needs witnesses, and the primary witness with direct operational knowledge of the Karan Valley is sitting in this waiting room. Mara held the coffee cup. It had gone cold. She looked at the door of the Admiral's room, the solid institutional door behind which the monitors continued their rhythms. I'm not going anywhere, she said. I know, Reyes said. I'm not asking you to commit to anything right now. I'm telling you what's true so you're not walking into the next phase of this without knowing the shape of it. How long before the Admiral can testify? Calvert thinks 2 weeks, minimum, before he's transport ready for Washington. Possibly 3. She paused. He's already requested that you be present for his initial debrief with the Oversight Committee staff. Specifically requested. The waiting room hummed its institutional hum. Down the corridor, a duty officer changed shifts with the quiet efficiency of a facility returning to its ordinary tempo. She thought about the 8 names, about the official record, about what training accident looked like on paper versus what November 14th had looked like in the valley. When the investigation becomes public, she said, what happens to the record on Meridian? That's a conversation that goes above my authority to confirm, Reyes said carefully. But what I can tell you is that the documentation we've recovered tonight, the compound evidence, the Cavill contractor connections, the CMG financial architecture connected to the Karan Valley operation, is the most comprehensive evidentiary base anyone has ever assembled around what happened to your unit. She held her gaze. The people above my authority are going to have to do something with it. It wasn't a promise. Mara had been around enough institutional machinery to know a carefully worded non-promise when she heard one. But she also knew the difference between a non-promise delivered to deflect and a non-promise delivered because the person making it genuinely couldn't speak for powers above them. She nodded. At 7:40 in the morning, with the sky outside finally lighter than the mountains, Admiral Marcus Webb was awake and alert enough to receive a brief visit. Calvert cleared it for 10 minutes, strict on the time limit, strict on the non-negotiability of the time limit. Mara went in. He looked better. Not good. Good wasn't available yet and possibly wouldn't be for weeks, but present in a way he hadn't been through the night. His eyes were clear. The monitors showed a rhythm that was arguable rather than alarming. They tell me the protocol you gave Calvert is why I'm talking to you right now, he said. Calvert's team did the work. On your instruction. He looked at her without the performance of gratitude, just directly, the way she'd found that people sometimes looked at you when they understood that you had made a specific choice that cost something. I want you to know I've read your service record, the complete record, not the version in the public file. She was quiet. I know what Meridian was doing in that valley, he said. I know what they found. My investigation has the documentation that confirms it. That's why I was on that plane last night. He paused. I know what was lost. She didn't trust herself to say anything to that, so she said nothing. When I testify, he said, I'm going to make sure the complete account is in the record, not the accident report. What actually happened and why? He looked at her with the steadiness of someone who had survived something and intended to make the survival mean something. I need you there when I do. I'll be there, she said. The 10 minutes concluded. Calvert appeared in the doorway with the expression of a physician whose time limits were not suggestions. She left the room. In the corridor, Reyes was on her phone again. She ended the call when Mara emerged and looked at her with the controlled expression of someone managing new information. Tell me, Mara said. The financial forensics team working the CMG documentation overnight found something. Reyes held her phone. A secondary payment structure, separate from the Greer stream and the Vantage Memorial operational streams, routed through 3 different CMG subsidiaries over the past 18 months into an account connected to a DOJ staffer. Mara went still. The staffer's office manages oversight coordination for federal medical facility security standards, Reyes said, which includes the contractor vetting protocols for installations like Fort Cavill. She thought about the contractor ID in the breach individual's wallet. She thought about Tully's employment file and its 3 references. She thought about a network that had been running for years, building infrastructure in the places that were supposed to stop it. Who knows about this? She said. Right now, the forensics team and me. Reyes looked at her. And whoever at DOJ has been watching the CMG investigation from a position of knowing where it was going. Mara looked down the corridor. The implications moved through her in sequence. each one landing with the specific gravity of something that changed the calculation on everything that came before it. If the network had reached into the office that managed contractor vetting for federal installations, then the security architecture that was supposed to be protecting this building, this investigation, this surviving witness. Solis, she said. I trust Solis. How far does your trust chain go? Reyes was quiet for a moment that was a half-second too long. We need to move the Admiral, Mara said. Calvert says, I heard what Calvert said. I also know what this compound does over time and what happens if the treatment protocol is disrupted. She looked at Reyes. And I know that if someone inside the DOJ oversight structure knows where the Admiral is right now and what the forensics team found overnight. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. A message from a number she recognized this time. Solis's direct line. 4 words. Check the medication cart. She looked at Reyes. Reyes had seen it over her shoulder. They were both already moving before either of them said anything. The ICU bay door opened from the inside as they reached it, and the night shift nurse, a man named Aldrich, whom Calvert had introduced as one of his most experienced overnight staff, stepped out with the particular body language of someone who had not expected company. He looked at Mara, at Reyes's hand. The medication cart was behind him, inside the bay, with a fresh IV bag hanging that had not been there 10 minutes ago. Mara looked at the bag, at the junction point, at the faint, nearly invisible trace of crystalline residue at the port. She had seen this before. She knew exactly what it was. And Aldrich, who had worked in this facility for 2 years with impeccable performance reviews and contractor-verified credentials, was standing between her and the Admiral's IV line, with nothing in his face except the specific calculation of a man who understood that the window he'd been given was narrowing. Reyes moved left. Mara moved right. Neither of them announced it. The geometry of the doorway and the position of the medication cart made the decision for them. And they were both people who had learned to let geometry do that work. Aldrich stepped back into the bay. That was the mistake. Not because stepping back was tactically wrong, but because it put him between 2 people who understood the room and the thing he needed to protect, the IV line, the port, the bag hanging from the pole, and it put the Admiral behind him in the bed, which meant his only option was to reach the line before either of them reached him. He went for the cart. Reyes was faster. She caught his arm at the cart's edge, and the struggle was brief and graceless in the way that real physical confrontations always were. Not choreographed, not clean, 2 people in a cart, and a bay that wasn't large enough for any of it. Aldrich was stronger than he looked, and he got one hand on the IV pole before Mara pulled the line from the port with the same motion she'd used in Trauma Bay 3 6 hours ago, the same certainty, the same understanding that the line was the thing and everything else was secondary. The bag swung free. Aldrich stopped fighting. Reyes had his arm behind his back, and the specific controlled breathing of someone who had absorbed a hit she wasn't going to mention and was managing the adrenaline with the system that had practiced this. Kowalski appeared in the doorway within seconds. He'd been positioned further down the corridor and had heard enough of it. The Admiral had not moved. He was watching from the bed with the stillness of someone who had been in contested spaces before, and understood that the most useful thing he could do right now was not contribute to the chaos. Line's clear, Mara said. She had the bag in her hand. The junction residue was unmistakable, the same compound, the same crystalline trace. Decker's network had placed Aldrich before tonight, before any of this, the same way they'd placed everything else. The long patience of people who had been doing this for years. He needs a new line, she said to Calvert, who had appeared in the doorway behind Kowalski, with the expression of a man recalibrating his assessment of his own staff in real time. Calvert came in and did what needed doing. He didn't say anything about Aldrich, who was now in Kowalski's custody in the corridor. He didn't say anything about the bag, which Reyes had already flagged for evidence. He focused on his patient because that was what Calvert did, and it was the right thing to do, and Mara stood at the foot of the bed and watched him work and let herself feel, briefly, the specific exhaustion of having done this exact thing twice in one night. The Admiral's eyes found her over Calvert's shoulder. She gave him a small nod. He gave her one back. It wasn't a dramatic exchange. It didn't need to be. Aldrich, in federal processing 2 hours later, made the decision to cooperate. He made it the way people made decisions when they understood clearly that the structure they'd believed would protect them had left them holding a contaminated IV bag in a military medical facility with 2 federal agents in the room. He gave 4 names. One was a CMG logistics manager who had facilitated the compound's transfer into the contractor supply chain. One was the DOJ staffer Reyes's forensics team had already identified. 2 were individuals embedded in federal contractor networks at 2 different military installations, neither of which was Fort Cavell. The thread had become a rope. The rope was long, and it was going to take time to pull to its end, but for the first time in 14 months of investigation and 3 years of everything that preceded it, the people doing the pulling had something solid in their hands. Leonard Decker was apprehended at 6:47 the following morning. He was found at a private airstrip outside a small town called Vernal, 80 miles from the Utah state line, in the company of Agent Tully and a pilot who claimed initially not to know anything. The pilot revised this claim quickly. Tully took slightly longer. Decker said nothing at all when the arrest team came through the hangar door, which was consistent with every calculation he'd made through the night. Quiet, contained, waiting to understand what he was working with before deciding what to do with it. He had a bag with him. Inside the bag, 2 passports in different names, a phone he attempted to destroy when the arrest team entered and failed to fully destroy, $40,000 in mixed currency, and a sealed medical case containing a quantity of the compound sufficient to cause significant harm to multiple individuals. The sealed case made the charges considerably worse than they had already been. The arrest happened on a Tuesday. By Friday, the indictment was unsealed and the CMG network was public, not just in the legal filings, but in the way that large federal cases became public when they were comprehensive enough to be undeniable. The defense contracting fraud, the weapons trafficking routes, the payments to Greer, to Tully, to the DOJ staffer whose name was Hoff, and who had apparently believed that his position was insulated enough from the financial thread to be safe. None of them were safe. Dorothy Greer had retained counsel and maintained her initial silence for 48 hours, then changed course when the financial documentation made silence into a liability she couldn't sustain. She gave a full statement. It was not enough to significantly reduce what she was facing, but it added names and dates and specifics to a record that was already extensive, and the investigators took what was useful and noted the rest. Petra, from the lab, cooperated fully from her first interview. She was 24 and had been recruited out of a pharmaceutical tech program by what she'd believed was a consulting opportunity connected to a CMG subsidiary. The money was real. The requests had seemed minor at first. The escalation had been gradual enough that by the time she understood what she was part of, the understanding came with the weight of everything she'd already done. She said this in her interview, and it was not a sufficient explanation, and she knew it and said so. Mara, when she read the interview transcript weeks later, thought that the specific horror of being 24 and understanding too late what you'd been slowly recruited into was its own kind of punishment, and also that it didn't change anything about what Petra had done, and that both of these things could be true at the same time. That was the complicated part that the news coverage didn't address, because news coverage tended to prefer the architecture of clear categories: victim, villain, bystander. The actual human material of what had happened at Vantage Memorial over 4 years didn't sort cleanly into those categories, except for Decker, who sorted without ambiguity. Leonard Decker was charged with treason, conspiracy to commit murder, murder in the second degree for the 2 Meridian personnel killed by the compound in the Caron Valley, attempted murder for Admiral Webb, obstruction of federal investigation, and 7 additional counts connected to the CMG network's financial architecture. The treason charge carried the heaviest weight. The murder charge carried a different kind of weight, the kind that belonged to 2 specific people whose names appeared in a federal charging document for the first time without the word accident attached to them. Mara read the indictment on a Thursday morning in a conference room at a federal building in Denver that smelled like old carpet and institutional coffee. Reyes had given her a copy before it was publicly filed. She read it alone. She read the 2 names, Petty Officer First Class Dominic Favre and Petty Officer Second Class Keisha Morrow, and the description of how they had died, which was precise and medical and entirely accurate, and she sat with the document on the table in front of her for a while. She thought about Favre, who had been from a small town in Louisiana and had a daughter named after a river. She thought about Morrow, who had been the most technically capable person she'd ever worked alongside and had been planning to go to medical school after her service contract ended. She didn't cry, which was not because she didn't feel it. She had learned, in the valley and in the 3 years since, that grief didn't always come as tears. Sometimes it came as the specific weight of a name on paper, finally in the right document with the right attribution. She folded the indictment. She put it in her jacket pocket. She went and got coffee from the machine in the hall, which was bad but not the worst she'd had that week, and she stood in the corridor and drank it and thought about the specific slow work of what came next. Admiral Marcus Webb testified before the Senate Oversight Subcommittee 6 weeks after the night at Fort Cavell. He was transported in a vehicle configuration that would have seemed excessive to anyone who didn't know the preceding 3 months of events, accompanied by a security detail that Solis had personally reviewed. He walked into the Senate chamber with a cane he would use for approximately 2 more months before he didn't need it, and he sat at the witness table and spoke for 4 hours. Mara was not in the chamber for the testimony. She was in a waiting room adjacent to it, which was where witness prep support personnel sat, which was the category she had been assigned under a temporary consulting arrangement with Reyes's division that had a lot of bureaucratic language in it, and essentially meant that she was there because Webb had asked for her to be there, and no one had found a reason to say no that was stronger than his asking. She heard portions of it through the closed door, not the words, the texture. The specific quality of a testimony that was going somewhere consequential, the rhythm of a record being built statement by statement, the occasional silence that meant something had landed. At the 2-hour mark, he named the Meridian unit by designation in his testimony. He described what the unit had been doing in the Caron Valley and what they had found and what the documents now in federal evidence showed about why the network had needed them stopped. He named Favre and Morrow by name. He named the other 5 who had died in the ambush and the days that followed it. He named Mara Voss, alive, by her service designation, as the surviving member who had preserved the knowledge and the testimony that had brought the case to this point. She heard her name through the door and the sound of the chamber going quiet. She looked at the bad carpet and the institutional wall and the ceiling tile above her, and she thought about all the ways she had tried to build a smaller, quieter life. The nursing degree, the 3 months at Vantage Memorial, the car in the parking lot, and the cold air, and the sense that she had traveled far enough from what she'd been that she could live in the distance. She thought about the saline bag and the supply corridor and the runner who'd been pulled to a pediatric code and the chain of random, institutional, unglamorous events that had placed her in Trauma Bay 3 at the exact moment the wrong thing was happening. She had not gone looking for any of this. She had been trying, genuinely and without drama, to be a nurse in a hospital in Colorado and leave the other things behind. The other things had not stayed behind. She thought about whether she was sorry for that and found, honestly, that she wasn't. Not because the past months hadn't cost her anything. They had cost her a great deal, in sleep and in the specific bodily knowledge of fear and in the reopening of things she'd spent 3 years carefully closing. But the cost had produced something, the names in the indictment, the charges, the record. 8 people who had died with the wrong explanation attached to them now had a different explanation, a true one, and it was in a federal document and it would persist. That was not nothing. It was not everything. Justice never was. But it was not nothing. She was still sitting with that thought when the door opened and Webb's aide came out and said the senator would like her to come in. She stood up. She went through the door. The chamber was larger than she'd expected and smaller than the idea of it. Webb was at the witness table, turned in his chair, looking at her with the particular expression she had come to recognize as his baseline, direct, without performance. The expression of a man who had decided some time ago to spend whatever time he had on things that mattered and had gotten better at identifying which things those were. The committee members were at their raised desk. Several of them were looking at her. The room had the particular quality of collective attention that made the air feel slightly different. She walked to the witness table. There was no formal protocol for what happened next, which meant it happened in the slightly imperfect, improvised way that things happened when they weren't choreographed. Webb stood from his chair, slowly, with the cane, without being entirely steady, and extended his hand. She shook it. He didn't let go immediately. He held her hand for a moment in both of his, which was not a gesture she had expected from him, and which she registered with the particular awareness of someone whose emotional guard was functional but not impenetrable. "Thank you," he said. Not loudly, just to her. She said, "Don't thank me. Put it on record." He looked at her. He almost smiled. Not quite. but almost. I just did. He sat back down. She took the witness chair beside him, where the aide had placed a placard with her name and service designation. She looked at the committee members. She looked at the room. She thought about a trauma bay in a hospital in Harlan, Colorado, and a syringe she had watched disappear into a line, and the specific ordinary moment when she had understood what it was and what it meant and what it was going to cost her to say something. She had said something. The chair of the committee, a woman named Senator Varda, who had the bearing of someone who had been doing this work for a long time and retained the specific quality of someone who still cared about doing it correctly, leaned toward her microphone. "Ms. Voss," she said, "we appreciate your presence today. I want to say, on behalf of this committee, that what you did, both in the service of your country during your time with Task Force Meridian and in the events of the past 6 weeks, reflects a level of courage that this committee intends to formally recognize." She paused. "And I want to say directly, the record will reflect the truth of what happened in the Caron Valley. That is a commitment from this committee." Mara nodded once. She didn't trust the moment with more than that. The testimony took 2 hours. She was precise. She was factual. She described the valley, the ambush, the compound, the events at Vantage Memorial, the events at Fort Cavell, in the same ordered way she had been describing them to investigators for 6 weeks, without embellishment, without the inflation of drama, because the facts were sufficient and the facts were what the record needed. At one point, Senator Varda asked her to describe the moment she had recognized the compound in Trauma Bay 3. Mara thought for a moment before answering. "I recognized it because I had watched it kill people I cared about," she said, "and because I had spent 3 years trying to understand why they died. And part of that understanding was knowing exactly what the mechanism looked like. It wasn't training. It wasn't a protocol. It was grief, converted into something useful." She paused. "I didn't go into that bay looking for anything. I was there to hang a saline bag. But when you know something, you know it. And when you know it, you have to decide what to do with the knowing." The room was quiet. "I decided to pull the line," she said. "I'd make the same decision again." The proceedings concluded. The formal record was entered. Mara walked out of the chamber into the adjacent corridor where Reyes was waiting with 2 cups of coffee that were marginally better than what the vending machine had produced. Reyes handed her one without commentary. They stood in the corridor and drank the coffee. "Decker's arraignment is next week," Reyes said after a while. "I know." "You don't have to be there." "I know that too." Reyes looked at her. "Are you going to be?" Mara thought about it. About what it would mean to sit in a courtroom and watch Leonard Decker be formally charged with the deaths of people whose names she had been carrying for 3 years. About whether witnessing that was something she needed or something she thought she should need, because it seemed like the kind of thing that provided closure, which was a concept she had become skeptical of. "Probably not," she said. "The record is the record. He doesn't need me in that room for it to be true." Reyes nodded. She seemed to understand this. The sentencing, when it came, 4 months later, after a trial that was thorough and occasionally brutal in its documentary evidence and concluded without significant ambiguity, was reported in detail. Leonard Decker received life in federal prison without the possibility of parole on the treason and murder charges. The additional counts added weight that was structurally redundant but symbolically necessary, which the judge noted in her sentencing remarks. Dorothy Greer received 11 years on conspiracy and obstruction counts, reduced from the initial charge structure by her cooperation, which her attorney framed as meaningful and the prosecution framed as partial, and the judge treated as exactly what it was, a mitigating factor of limited significance given the scale of what had been facilitated. Hoff, the DOJ staffer, received 8 years. Tully received 12. Aldrich received 6, with his cooperation agreement that had produced 2 of the additional names in the CMG network. CMG itself, Carver Mass Group, the holding company at the center of the financial architecture, was dissolved by court order, its assets frozen pending forfeiture proceedings that would take years to fully resolve. The principals fled in multiple directions and were apprehended in multiple directions, one by one, over the subsequent months, which was unglamorous and procedural and looked nothing like the single dramatic conclusion that narrative tidiness would have preferred. Real dismantling looked like paperwork and extradition requests and freezing orders and testimony and more testimony and the slow, grinding work of institutions that sometimes moved toward justice with a speed that was deeply unsatisfying but still, eventually, moved. Mara watched it from a distance. She was not distant from it. She remained a witness, a consultant, a participant in the ongoing case in ways that required her presence in various rooms over various months. But she watched the shape of it with the particular detachment of someone who had decided not to let the outcome of external processes be the thing that determined her internal equilibrium. She had learned this in the valley, actually, though she hadn't had words for it then. The thing that kept you functional in environments designed to destroy you was not optimism, and not certainty, and not the belief that things would resolve the way they should. It was the decision to keep doing the next right thing, regardless of what the things after it looked like. You pulled the line. You gave the testimony, you put the names in the record, and then you got up the next morning and you figured out what the next right thing was. 6 months after the night at Vantage Memorial, Mara Voss returned to nursing. Not at Vantage Memorial, which was under institutional review and would be for some time. She took a position at a level 1 trauma center in Denver, larger than Vantage, busier, with the specific organized chaos of a facility that handled the full range of what a city produced. She was not hired as a floor nurse. The position was in the trauma department, created partly in response to the recognition, slow, institutional, imperfect, that her clinical capabilities exceeded the standard ER nurse designation she had been operating under. The hiring process had been unusual. Her application had included a note from Admiral Marcus Webb, now recovered sufficiently to return to partial duties, that described her clinical intervention with a specificity and a weight that made the hiring committee's conversation brief. It had also included a letter from Calvert at Fort Cavell that addressed her knowledge of the compound's mechanism and what it had meant for the Admiral's survival, which was not information the general public had, and which the committee absorbed with the particular seriousness of people encountering something outside their ordinary frame. She started on a Monday in September. The trauma bay was different from Vantage Memorials in the way that all trauma bays were different, and none of them were. The equipment positioned slightly differently, the light the same. The particular smell of a space that had seen everything and would see more. On her second shift, there was a critical case. Pediatric, mechanism unclear, presenting in a way that confused the first attending and sent him for a consult. Mara was in the corridor when they brought the child in, and she looked at the presentation and said quietly to the attending, "Check the potassium, something's suppressing the cardiac response, and it's not the presenting injury." The attending looked at her. She held his gaze. He checked the potassium. She was right. The child made it. The attending found her later in the break room where she was eating a sandwich she had started 40 minutes ago and was mostly cold by now. "How did you know?" he asked. She thought about how to answer that honestly, about the valley and the flight surgeon and 3 years of living inside a specific kind of knowledge, and the various ways she had tried to put it somewhere it didn't interfere with the life she was attempting to build. "I paid attention to the wrong things for a long time," she said, "and then they turned out to be the right things." He looked at her with the expression of someone who had received an answer that was both complete and insufficient. "Okay," he said. She finished the sandwich. 3 months later, she received a package at the hospital. No return address, which made her look at it carefully before opening it. Inside was a folded document and a note. The note was from Reyes. 2 sentences. Official. Took some doing. The document was a military record amendment. Formal language, stamped and authenticated, correcting the classification of Task Force Meridian's dissolution from operational accident to unlawful engagement resulting from intelligence compromise. The 7 names were listed. The amendment cited the federal investigation, the trial record, and the Senate committee's formal findings. At the bottom, in the section for supplementary notation, someone had added a line that was not standard language. It had the quality of something that had been argued for and inserted at the cost of some bureaucratic capital. The service and sacrifice of Task Force Meridian personnel is recognized with honor. She read it once. She folded it carefully along its original creases. She put it in the locker where she kept her personal items during shifts, behind her jacket and her car keys and a photograph she'd been carrying for 3 years. 8 people at a staging area, candid, someone's personal camera. The particular quality of a photograph taken by people who didn't know it was going to be the last one. She closed the locker. She went back to work. That was not the end of it. because these things did not have clean ends. The case continued its procedural life. The CMG network continued to produce arrests in dribs and drabs that made occasional brief appearances in news coverage that most people read past. Decker sat in federal prison and, according to Reyes, in a call 6 months after sentencing, continued to say very little and look at his attorneys with the expression of a man working through calculations that no longer had viable outcomes. None of that was the end of it. But it was also not the thing that mattered most, which was something Mara had come to understand gradually and imperfectly, and without any dramatic moment of realization. The thing that mattered most was not Decker in prison, though that mattered. It was not her name in a Senate record, though that mattered too. It was the child in the trauma bay on her second shift, with the suppressed cardiac response that a different attending might have missed for another 10 minutes. It was Favre's name in a federal charging document with the right explanation beside it. It was Morrow's medical school application, which Mara had found in a personal effects file during the investigation, and which she had quietly, through channels that took several months to navigate, delivered to Morrow's sister, who had not known it existed. It was the specific, ordinary, unremarkable work of being in the right place and knowing the right thing and deciding again and again to say it, regardless of who told her she was just a nurse, regardless of the cost of saying it, regardless of the fact that the cost was sometimes real and sometimes steep and never distributed fairly. She had been told, in various rooms and in various ways over the course of the past year, that she was remarkable. She understood why people said it, and she did not think they were wrong exactly, but she also thought that the word missed something important. The things she had done in Trauma Bay 3 had not required her to be remarkable. It had required her to be paying attention and to be willing to act on what she saw. Those were learnable things. They were things that anyone who had been paying the cost of attention for long enough could develop. The difference was not that she was exceptional. The difference was that she had not stopped paying attention when it became expensive. She had not looked away from the residue on the junction point because looking at it meant she was going to have to do something about it. She had not pretended to be uncertain when she wasn't uncertain. She had just looked at what was in front of her and done the next right thing. That was all. That was everything. She had a shift in 20 minutes. She pulled on her jacket. She closed the locker. She walked back into the trauma department, where the bay was already occupied and the monitors were running, and the particular organized urgency of a space that did not stop was moving at its usual tempo. Someone called her name. She answered. She went to work. Not because anyone was watching, and not because it was going to be easy, and not because the world had arranged itself into something just or fair or clean. It hadn't, and it wouldn't, and the distance between what things should be and what they were was a distance she had learned to walk inside rather than wait to have closed. She went to work because she was good at it, because it mattered, because somewhere in the long distance between the Caron Valley and a trauma bay in Denver, she had learned that the most durable form of strength was not the kind that waited for recognition before it acted. It was the kind that acted anyway, in the ordinary moments before anyone was looking, and trusted that the looking would eventually come. It had come, and she had not changed a single thing about who she was to make it happen. That, more than anything else, was the thing worth keeping. The other things had not stayed behind. She thought about whether she was sorry for that, and found, honestly, that she wasn't. Not because the past months hadn't cost her anything. They had cost her a great deal, in sleep and in the specific bodily knowledge of fear, and in the reopening of things she'd spent 3 years carefully closing. But the cost had produced something. The names in the indictment, the charges, the record. 8 people who had died with the wrong explanation attached to them now had a different explanation, a true one, and it was in a federal document, and it would persist. That was not nothing. It was not everything, justice never was, but it was not nothing. She was still sitting with that thought when the door opened and Webb's aide came out and said the senator would like her to come in. She stood up. She went through the door. The chamber was larger than she'd expected and smaller than the idea of it. Webb was at the witness table, turned in his chair, looking at her with the particular expression she had come to recognize as his baseline, direct, without performance, the expression of a man who had decided some time ago to spend whatever time he had on things that mattered and had gotten better at identifying which things those were. The committee members were at their raised desk. Several of them were looking at her. The room had the particular quality of collective attention that made the air feel slightly different. She walked to the witness table. There was no formal protocol for what happened next, which meant it happened in the slightly imperfect, improvised way that things happened when they weren't choreographed. Webb stood from his chair, slowly, with the cane, without being entirely steady, and extended his hand. She shook it. He didn't let go immediately. He held her hand for a moment in both of his, which was not a gesture she had expected from him, and which she registered with the particular awareness of someone whose emotional guard was functional but not impenetrable. "Thank you," he said. Not loudly, just to her. She said, "Don't thank me. Put it on record." He looked at her. He almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. "I just did." He sat back down. She took the witness chair beside him, where the aide had placed a placard with her name and service designation. She looked at the committee members. She looked at the room. She thought about a trauma bay in a hospital in Harlan, Colorado, and a syringe she had watched disappear into a line, and the specific ordinary moment when she had understood what it was, and what it meant, and what it was going to cost her to say something. She had said something. The chair of the committee, a woman named Senator Varda, who had the bearing of someone who had been doing this work for a long time and retained the specific quality of someone who still cared about doing it correctly, leaned toward her microphone. "Ms. Voss," she said, "we appreciate your presence today. I want to say, on behalf of this committee, that what you did, both in the service of your country during your time with Task Force Meridian and in the events of the past 6 weeks, reflects a level of courage that this committee intends to formally recognize." She paused. "And I want to say directly, the record will reflect the truth of what happened in the Caron Valley. That is a commitment from this committee." Mara nodded once. She didn't trust the moment with more than that. The testimony took 2 hours. She was precise. She was factual. She described the valley, the ambush, the compound, the events at Vantage Memorial, the events at Fort Cavell, in the same ordered way she had been describing them to investigators for 6 weeks, without embellishment, without the inflation of drama, because the facts were sufficient and the facts were what the record needed. At one point, Senator Varda asked her to describe the moment she had recognized the compound in Trauma Bay 3. Mara thought for a moment before answering. "I recognized it because I had watched it kill people I cared about," she said, "and because I had spent 3 years trying to understand why they died. And part of that understanding was knowing exactly what the mechanism looked like. It wasn't training. It wasn't a protocol. It was grief, converted into something useful." She paused. "I didn't go into that bay looking for anything. I was there to hang a saline bag. But when you know something, you know it. And when you know it, you have to decide what to do with the knowing." The room was quiet. "I decided to pull the line," she said. "I'd make the same decision again." The proceedings concluded. The formal record was entered. Mara walked out of the chamber into the adjacent corridor where Reyes was waiting with 2 cups of coffee that were marginally better than what the vending machine had produced. Reyes handed her one without commentary. They stood in the corridor and drank the coffee. "Decker's arraignment is next week," Reyes said after a while. "I know. You don't have to be there." "I know that too." Reyes looked at her. "Are you going to be?" Mara thought about it. About what it would mean to sit in a courtroom and watch Leonard Decker be formally charged with the deaths of people whose names she had been carrying for 3 years. About whether witnessing that was something she needed or something she thought she should need because it seemed like the kind of thing that provided closure, which was a concept she had become skeptical of. "Probably not," she said. "The record is the record. He doesn't need me in that room for it to be true." Reyes nodded. She seemed to understand this. The sentencing, when it came, 4 months later, after a trial that was thorough and occasionally brutal in its documentary evidence and concluded without significant ambiguity, was reported in detail. Leonard Decker received life in federal prison without the possibility of parole on the treason and murder charges. The additional counts added weight that was structurally redundant but symbolically necessary, which the judge noted in her sentencing remarks. Dorothy Greer received 11 years on conspiracy and obstruction counts, reduced from the initial charge structure by her cooperation, which her attorney framed as meaningful and the prosecution framed as partial, and the judge treated as exactly what it was, a mitigating factor of limited significance given the scale of what had been facilitated. Hoff, the DOJ staffer, received 8 years. Tully received 12. Aldrich received 6, with the cooperation agreement that had produced two of the additional names in the CMG network. CMG itself, Carver Mass Group, the holding company at the center of the financial architecture, was dissolved by court order, its assets frozen pending forfeiture proceedings that would take years to fully resolve. The principals fled in multiple directions and were apprehended in multiple directions, one by one, over the subsequent months, which was unglamorous and procedural and looked nothing like the single dramatic conclusion that narrative tidiness would have preferred. Real dismantling looked like paperwork and extradition requests and freezing orders and more testimony and the slow, grinding work of institutions that sometimes moved toward justice with a speed that was deeply unsatisfying but still, eventually, moved. Mara watched it from a distance. She was not distant from it. She remained a witness, a consultant, a participant in the ongoing case in ways that required her presence in various rooms over various months. But she watched the shape of it with the particular detachment of someone who had decided not to let the outcome of external processes be the thing that determined her internal equilibrium. She had learned this in the valley, actually, though she hadn't had words for it then. The thing that kept you functional in environments designed to destroy you was not optimism, and not certainty, and not the belief that things would resolve the way they should. It was the decision to keep doing the next right thing, regardless of what the things after it looked like. You pulled the line, you gave the testimony, you put the names in the record, and then you got up the next morning and you figured out what the next right thing was. 6 months after the night at Vantage Memorial, Mara Voss returned to nursing. Not at Vantage Memorial, which was under institutional review and would be for some time. She took a position at a level 1 trauma center in Denver, larger than Vantage, busier, with the specific organized chaos of a facility that handled the full range of what a city produced. She was not hired as a floor nurse. The position was in the trauma department, created partly in response to the recognition, slow, institutional, imperfect, that her clinical capabilities exceeded the standard ER nurse designation she had been operating under. The hiring process had been unusual. Her application had included a note from Admiral Marcus Webb, now recovered sufficiently to return to partial duties, that described her clinical intervention with a specificity and a weight that made the hiring committee's conversation brief. It had also included a letter from Calvert at Fort Cavell that addressed her knowledge of the compound's mechanism and what it had meant for the Admiral's survival, which was not information the general public had, and which the committee absorbed with the particular seriousness of people encountering something outside their ordinary frame. She started on a Monday in September. The trauma bay was different from Vantage Memorials in the way that all trauma bays were different, and none of them were. The equipment positioned slightly differently, the light the same, the particular smell of a space that had seen everything and would see more. On her second shift, there was a critical case. Pediatric, mechanism unclear, presenting in a way that confused the first attending and sent him for a consult. Mara was in the corridor when they brought the child in, and she looked at the presentation and said quietly to the attending, "Check the potassium, something's suppressing the cardiac response, and it's not the presenting injury." The attending looked at her. She held his gaze. He checked the potassium. She was right. The child made it. The attending found her later in the break room where she was eating a sandwich she had started 40 minutes ago and was mostly cold by now. "How did you know?" he asked. She thought about how to answer that honestly. About the valley and the flight surgeon and 3 years of living inside a specific kind of knowledge and the various ways she had tried to put it somewhere, it didn't interfere with the life she was attempting to build. "I paid attention to the wrong things for a long time," she said, "and then they turned out to be the right things." He looked at her with the expression of someone who had received an answer that was both complete and insufficient. "Okay," he said. She finished the sandwich. 3 months later, she received a package at the hospital. No return address, which made her look at it carefully before opening it. Inside was a folded document and a note. The note was from Reyes. 2 sentences. Official. Took some doing. The document was a military record amendment. Formal language, stamped and authenticated, correcting the classification of Task Force Meridian's dissolution from operational accident to unlawful engagement resulting from intelligence compromise. The 7 names were listed. The amendment cited the federal investigation, the trial record, and the Senate committee's formal findings. At the bottom, in the section for supplementary notation, someone had added a line that was not standard language. It had the quality of something that had been argued for and inserted at the cost of some bureaucratic capital. The service and sacrifice of Task Force Meridian personnel is recognized with honor. She read it once. She folded it carefully along its original creases. She put it in the locker where she kept her personal items during shifts, behind her jacket, and her car keys, and a photograph she'd been carrying for 3 years. 8 people at a staging area, candid, someone's personal camera, the particular quality of a photograph taken by people who didn't know it was going to be the last one. She closed the locker. She went back to work. That was not the end of it, because these things did not have clean ends. The case continued its procedural life. The CMG network continued to produce arrests in dribs and drabs that made occasional brief appearances in news coverage that most people read past. Decker sat in federal prison and, according to Reyes in a call 6 months after sentencing, continued to say very little and look at his attorneys with the expression of a man working through calculations that no longer had viable outcomes. None of that was the end of it. But it was also not the thing that mattered most, which was something Mara had come to understand gradually and imperfectly and without any dramatic moment of realization. The thing that mattered most was not Decker in prison, though that mattered. It was not her name in a Senate record, though that mattered too. It was the child in the trauma bay on her second shift, with the suppressed cardiac response that a different attending might have missed for another 10 minutes. It was Favre's name in a federal charging document with the right explanation beside it. It was Morrow's medical school application, which Mara had found in a personal effects file during the investigation and which she had quietly, through channels that took several months to navigate, delivered to Morrow's sister, who had not known it existed. It was the specific, ordinary, unremarkable work of being in the right place and knowing the right thing and deciding, again and again, to say it, regardless of who told her she was just a nurse, regardless of the cost of saying it, regardless of the fact that the cost was sometimes real and sometimes steep and never distributed fairly. She had been told, in various rooms and in various ways over the course of the past year, that she was remarkable. She understood why people said it, and she did not think they were wrong, exactly, but she also thought that the word missed something important. The thing she had done in Trauma Bay 3 had not required her to be remarkable. It had required her to be paying attention and to be willing to act on what she saw. Those were learnable things. They were things that anyone who had been paying the cost of attention for long enough could develop. The difference was not that she was exceptional. The difference was that she had not stopped paying attention when it became expensive. She had not looked away from the residue on the junction point because looking at it meant she was going to have to do something about it. She had not pretended to be uncertain when she wasn't uncertain. She had just looked at what was in front of her and done the next right thing. That was all. That was everything. She had a shift in 20 minutes. She pulled on her jacket. She closed the locker. She walked back into the trauma department, where the bay was already occupied and the monitors were running, and the particular organized urgency of a space that did not stop was moving at its usual tempo. Someone called her name. She answered. She went to work. Not because anyone was watching, and not because it was going to be easy, and not because the world had arranged itself into something just or fair or clean. It hadn't, and it wouldn't. And the distance between what things should be and what they were was a distance she had learned to walk inside rather than wait to have closed. She went to work because she was good at it, because it mattered, because somewhere in the long distance between the Caron Valley and a trauma bay in Denver, she had learned that the most durable form of strength was not the kind that waited for recognition before it acted. It was the kind that acted anyway, in the ordinary moments before anyone was looking, and trusted that the looking would eventually come. It had come. And she had not changed a single thing about who she was to make it happen. That, more than anything else, was the thing worth keeping.